Alexander Hayes sat alone in his high-rise office, surrounded by vast walls of glass that revealed the bustling city below. The view stretched for miles, yet he found no comfort in it. To most of the world, Alexander was an untouchable figure, powerful, wealthy, and relentless in his pursuits. But the solitude he carried was something he never shared, and certainly something no one could see in the cold, calculated way he moved through life. Tonight, he barely looked up from his desk, his face cast in the glow of a single, dim lamp. In his hand, he held a delicate silver watch. It was worn, the kind of object that didn't match his polished image, and it would seem like an odd relic in his hands. If anyone could see him here, the watch had belonged to his son, a boy taken from him too soon, under circumstances he still couldn't talk about. With every tick, the memories of that life, now gone, crept closer, threatening the walls he'd spent years building around himself. "Mr. Hayes, the charity event has started." His assistant's voice cut through his thoughts, crisp and distant. He didn't answer at first, letting the silence fill the room once again. He slipped the watch back into a drawer and closed it with deliberate calm. "I'll be down shortly," he replied, his tone void of warmth. As he stood, he straightened his jacket, brushing away any signs of his momentary distraction. To him, these events were a necessary show of involvement, a way to maintain appearances, not an occasion to connect with others. He'd often wished for a way to avoid them entirely, but tonight, something in the back of his mind felt different, though he ignored it. The ballroom below was already filled with people. Investors, influencers, and the city's elite, each chatting, laughing, and subtly measuring one another. Alexander moved through the crowd with practiced indifference, his eyes scanning the faces around him. Amid the chaos, he felt more removed than ever, each conversation reminding him of the hollow connections he endured night after night. "Alexander Hayes," a voice broke through the crowd, halting him mid-step. The speaker was a young man with an easy, almost magnetic confidence. He extended a hand and smiled, looking slightly out of place in the glamorous setting. "Daniel Scott." He introduced himself, his handshake firm and steady. Alexander studied the young man, surprised by the simplicity of his presence. Unlike the usual eventgoers, Daniel didn't seem to be trying to impress or intimidate anyone. Instead, he radiated a warmth that struck Alexander as both unusual and oddly unsettling. "Mr. Hayes," Daniel continued, "it's an honor to meet you. I run a small restaurant in the city, just a startup, but your work, well, it's been an inspiration for me." Alexander narrowed his gaze. "I'm not sure how inspiring my line of work is to a chef," he said, his tone curt. "Not so much the business, but the discipline it takes to build something on your own," Daniel responded, his sincerity unwavering. "In a way, it's what I hope to achieve." Alexander remained silent, feeling an inexplicable sense of discomfort. It was as if he were looking at someone from another life, someone who could have been part of his own story had things turned out differently. The way Daniel's eyes held steady, the kindness in his expression, it stirred something he had buried deep. "You remind me of someone," he found himself saying, almost involuntarily. It wasn't like him to engage this way, especially with a stranger. Daniel looked slightly taken aback, but he recovered quickly. "I hope that's a good thing," he replied, a slight smile crossing his face. Alexander was about to respond when he noticed a small, faint mark on Daniel's hand, a birthmark in the shape of a crescent. A memory flashed through his mind, vivid and painful. His son, holding his small hand out to show the same distinct mark. The room spun slightly, but Alexander steeled himself, keeping his face impassive. "Yes," he said, regaining his composure. "It is, or at least it was." The night continued at a leisurely pace, with guests swirling from one conversation to the next. Despite his usual detachment, Alexander couldn't ignore the strange unease that lingered after meeting Daniel. He found himself scanning the room, unable to settle into the monotony of pleasantries and networking. His thoughts circled back to the young restaurateur with an intensity that surprised him. After some time, Alexander spotted Daniel at the far end of the ballroom, talking animatedly with a group of younger attendees, likely other newcomers in the city's elite circle. Daniel's easy demeanor and genuine laughter stood in stark contrast to the others around him, who wore smiles that seemed carefully rehearsed. Alexander's eyes locked onto the faint birthmark on Daniel's hand as he gestured, a detail that seemed to shine like a beacon in the dimly lit room. "Mr. Hayes," a voice interrupted his train of thought, drawing his gaze to an older, well-dressed man who had sidled up beside him. Alexander recognized him as George Lewin, a longtime investor and frequent attendee of these charity galas. "Good to see you here," George said, extending a hand. "The event's quite the success, wouldn't you say?" Alexander forced a polite nod. "Yes, quite," he replied, though his mind was still preoccupied. George seemed not to notice Alexander's distraction, launching into a detailed recount of his latest business endeavor. Alexander responded minimally, nodding at the appropriate moments, but his gaze drifted back toward Daniel, who was now excusing himself from the group. The young man moved toward the entrance, likely slipping away for a moment's reprieve from the crowd. "Excuse me, George," Alexander said abruptly, cutting the man off mid-sentence. Without waiting for a reply, he made his way through the crowd, following Daniel out of the ballroom. As he stepped into the cool night air, Alexander felt a pang of self-doubt. He wasn't the type to follow strangers, especially not on a whim. But there was something he couldn't ignore, an inexplicable urge driving him forward. Outside, Daniel was leaning against a railing, looking out over the city. He seemed lost in thought, his posture relaxed, unaware of Alexander's approach. Alexander stopped a few paces behind him, unsure of what he even intended to say. The faint noise of the city surrounded them, filling the silence between them. After a moment, Daniel glanced back and noticed Alexander. A surprised but friendly smile crossed his face. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted warmly, straightening up. "Didn't think I'd see you out here." "Didn't expect to be here myself," Alexander replied, somewhat uncharacteristically. He hesitated, feeling unprepared for the words that followed. You mentioned earlier that my work inspired you. Why's that?" Daniel's expression shifted, as if he hadn't expected such a direct question. He looked back out at the city before responding, his voice thoughtful. "I suppose it's the perseverance," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I started from scratch, working in small kitchens, watching every expense. I never thought I'd get this far. I've read about your career, and I admire how you built your empire from the ground up, too." Alexander was silent, taken aback by the young man's sincerity. Daniel wasn't trying to flatter him. It was a simple, earnest admiration. But behind the admiration, Alexander sensed something deeper, perhaps a longing that mirrored his own, the kind he himself had buried beneath years of work and survival. As he glanced again at Daniel's hand, he struggled to contain his curiosity. "That mark on your hand," he began, his voice coming out more tightly than he'd intended. "How did you get it?" Daniel looked down at his hand, his brow furrowing slightly. "Oh, it's always been there. My foster mother used to say it was a good luck mark." He chuckled, a touch of sadness in his voice. "Not that I ever believed it much." "Foster mother?" Alexander's voice caught slightly, his heart hammering. The pieces were lining up in a way that felt almost surreal, yet he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice softening as he spoke. "I grew up in foster care. Never knew my birth parents." He shrugged, as if it were a simple fact, but Alexander could see the faint trace of pain beneath his words. "It wasn't easy, but I made it through." Alexander's mind was racing now. He'd lost his son, presumed dead, years ago, in a tragic incident that had left his life hollow. The boy had been so young, so full of potential. Yet cruel fate had taken him before he even had a chance to live. And now here was Daniel, with a mark identical to his son's, a life story shrouded in mystery, and an undeniable resemblance in the small, unspoken ways he carried himself. For the first time in years, Alexander's composure began to fracture. His voice softened, almost breaking through the shield he held up around himself. "Do you ever think about your parents?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Daniel seemed surprised by the question but answered after a pause. "Sometimes," he admitted. I wonder who they were. Why they weren't there. He cleared his throat, glancing away, but then forced a small smile. I guess I've always just been curious, but it's something you get used to not knowing. Alexander clenched his fists, feeling a rare surge of emotion. He was terrified of what this all might mean, yet he couldn't walk away. Every instinct told him that there was something here, something he had to uncover, no matter the risk to his carefully guarded heart. Well, he managed to say, his voice barely steady, if you ever need help finding those answers, you might not have to do it alone. Daniel's eyes flickered with a glimmer of surprise, as if he'd just been given something he hadn't dared to wish for. He smiled, though there was an edge of confusion. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I appreciate that, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the city fading into the background. Alexander's mind raced with questions, with doubts, but also with an overwhelming, fragile hope. Alexander returned to his office that night feeling as if a door, long closed, had been left ajar. Every attempt he made to return to his usual work routine was futile. Numbers and reports blurred before his eyes, replaced by the image of Daniel's hand. The same crescent-shaped birthmark that had marked his son. A mark Alexander had once traced with his fingers, marveling at how unique it was, promising himself he would always protect his child. That promise haunted him now. Unable to shake the thought, Alexander decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He allowed himself to revisit the memories. He opened the small, locked drawer on the corner of his desk, the one he rarely acknowledged, and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of his son, taken shortly before his disappearance. The boy's eyes, bright with innocence and curiosity, seemed to reach out from the photograph, frozen in time. That same energy, that silent curiosity, had been there in Daniel's gaze, too. He couldn't ignore the feeling that kept gnawing at him. By morning, Alexander had resolved to find out more about Daniel Scott. He contacted a private investigator he trusted, someone discreet enough to keep this inquiry out of the media's reach. The instructions were simple. Learn everything there was to know about the young man's past. 2 days later, the investigator returned with a report. Alexander sat in his office, looking down at the file on his desk, feeling his heart race as he opened it. Inside were the basics of Daniel's life. His birth records were incomplete, with only a vague note of being left at a foster home when he was only a few months old. No birth parents named. No family connections. The boy had drifted through various foster homes, apparently quiet and reserved, until he aged out of the system. And all of it confirmed one glaring fact. Daniel had no known biological family. Alexander's eyes lingered on each detail, on the thin paper that now held such weight. His breath caught as he continued reading, his mind already spinning. If his son had somehow survived and been taken from him, could he have ended up in the same foster care system, growing up with no knowledge of where he truly came from? In his heart, a cautious, fragile hope began to take root. There was still much he didn't know, and he couldn't jump to conclusions. Yet, the signs were undeniable, like pieces of a puzzle that had started to align after years of scattering. The next day, he found himself back at Daniel's restaurant, under the guise of checking in on the young entrepreneur. He entered the establishment, a small, charming place that was filled with the warm scent of freshly cooked meals. The tables were filled with patrons, each savoring their food with contentment that showed Daniel's work was more than just a business. It was a place he had poured his heart into. A waitress greeted him, surprised at his visit. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. Daniel's in the back, if you'd like to see him," she offered. "Thank you," Alexander replied, feeling a strange mix of nerves and anticipation as he walked toward the kitchen. As he neared the doorway, he saw Daniel at work, his face focused, hands moving skillfully as he plated a dish with the care of someone truly passionate about his craft. For a moment, Alexander simply watched, observing the way Daniel's brow furrowed in concentration, the way he moved with the same quiet confidence his own son had once displayed. It was both beautiful and painful. Finally, he cleared his throat, and Daniel looked up, startled but then smiling when he saw who it was. "Mr. Hayes, what a surprise," he greeted, wiping his hands on a towel as he walked over. Didn't expect to see you here. Alexander forced a small smile, but his gaze was intense, scrutinizing every detail. I was in the area and thought I'd drop by, see how things were going, he replied. Well, you're just in time. We're packed tonight, which is always a good thing. Daniel glanced around the bustling restaurant with a look of pride. Business has been steady since we opened. I'd like to think we're doing something right here. You certainly are, Alexander murmured, his voice carrying a weight that made Daniel pause. He held Daniel's gaze, struggling with the urge to ask him about his past, to bridge the gap between what he knew and what he feared to hope. You know, Daniel said, breaking the silence, it's a bit intimidating having someone like you as a customer. He chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. You're practically a legend around here. Being a legend doesn't amount to much, Alexander replied, almost to himself. You start to wonder what it all means after a while. Daniel looked at him curiously. Is that why you do these charity events? To give back? Maybe, Alexander said. His voice softened. But it's never quite enough. He hesitated, then plunged forward. Daniel, I've been meaning to ask you something. Do you remember anything about where you came from? Your childhood? Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. Not much, he admitted. I bounced between foster homes. It's all a bit blurry, to be honest. Alexander nodded, though his chest tightened at the response. I'm sorry to bring it up. I have this feeling we might share something in common. Something I lost a long time ago, he said, choosing his words carefully. Daniel tilted his head, studying Alexander with an expression of growing intrigue. Like what? Alexander took a breath. Family. A son I lost when he was just a child. There's something about you that reminds me of him, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Daniel was silent, his face a mixture of surprise and confusion. Then he spoke, his voice hesitant. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hayes. I don't know what to say, except I've wondered my whole life where I came from, who my parents were, why they weren't there. Maybe that's why I focus so much on this place. He gestured around the restaurant. It's something I built on my own, a home I didn't get to have. Alexander's heart ached at Daniel's words. He could see the same ache in Daniel's eyes, the unspoken pain of a boy who had grown up without answers. He felt a connection to this young man he could hardly explain, a connection he hadn't felt in years. If you're open to it, I could help you, Alexander said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Help you find those answers. Daniel's gaze softened, and he nodded slowly, though his face showed a mix of hope and hesitation. That would mean a lot to me, he said quietly, almost as if afraid of believing it. Alexander felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Over the next week, Alexander's life took a quiet but undeniable shift. His days, once rigidly focused on his business, were now punctuated by a growing obsession with unraveling Daniel's past. Though he maintained his usual stern exterior, his mind was constantly turning, piecing together fragments of memories, doubts, and a strange, undeniable pull toward the young man. His investigator was working around the clock, tracking down old files, birth records, and any traces that could hint at a possible connection between them. But nothing came easily. Every step forward seemed to reveal yet another layer of obscurity, an adoption file that didn't match, a closed foster home without surviving records, a name scratched out on a birth certificate. Daniel's past was like a maze, carefully hidden and purposefully erased. Alexander felt frustration gnaw at him, the sense that he was inching closer to a truth he wasn't supposed to uncover. And yet, his drive only grew stronger. He continued to visit Daniel at his restaurant under the guise of checking in, though they both knew these visits had taken on a different significance. Daniel, initially a little uncertain, had grown more comfortable with Alexander's presence, even beginning to look forward to his visits. In Alexander, he found an older figure he could talk to, a strange feeling, as he'd never really had a father figure in his life. Their conversations, though often brief, were filled with a quiet understanding, a connection that needed few words. One night, after the dinner rush had faded and the restaurant was nearly empty, Alexander sat across from Daniel in a quiet corner booth. The restaurant staff was cleaning up, moving quietly in the background, giving them a sense of privacy. Alexander studied Daniel, noting the weariness in his eyes. He sensed that the young man had been carrying a heavy weight for years, and it pained him to think of how much he might have endured alone. "Daniel," Alexander began cautiously, "have you ever tried to search for your parents? Or do you even want to?" Daniel hesitated, leaning back in his seat, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. "I did once, a long time ago," he admitted, his voice soft. "When I turned 18, I figured I'd finally have access to my records. But all I found were names I didn't recognize and files that led nowhere. I even tried reaching out to some of the social workers, but they'd either retired or didn't remember me." He looked up, a faint smile tinged with sadness. "After a while, I just stopped. It felt like chasing a ghost." Alexander's chest tightened. He could sense the resignation in Daniel's voice, the quiet acceptance that he might never find the answers he sought. But for Alexander, letting go wasn't an option. Not now. Not when he felt they were on the edge of a revelation. He leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I think it's time you got the answers you deserve, Daniel. Sometimes, all it takes is a little push, someone willing to look in the right places." Daniel studied him, his gaze skeptical but curious. "Why are you so invested in this, Mr. Hayes?" he asked. "We barely know each other, and yet, you've been here, helping me more than anyone else ever has." Alexander felt a moment of vulnerability, his guarded exterior cracking. He struggled to find the right words, not wanting to reveal too much too soon. "I suppose I see something of myself in you," he said quietly. "And maybe it's selfish, but I want to know if there's a part of me that's still out there." Daniel looked away, swallowing hard as he processed Alexander's words. The notion that someone could care that deeply, even after years of detachment, stirred something inside him. He had grown up believing that he had no one, that his life was an island he would have to survive on alone. But here was Alexander, a man he'd once admired from a distance, now willing to wade through his past. "I don't know what to say," Daniel finally replied. No one's ever tried this hard for me." Alexander simply nodded, sensing the weight of Daniel's gratitude. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just let me do this. I need to know as much as you do." Their conversation lingered, neither of them moving to end it. Alexander noticed a hint of hope in Daniel's expression, a glint that hadn't been there before. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and a shared understanding that this journey, no matter where it led, would change them both. The next day, Alexander's investigator contacted him with new information. There was a lead, a connection to a now-defunct adoption agency that had operated under questionable practices during the years Daniel would have been placed in foster care. The investigator warned Alexander that it might be difficult to obtain records from an agency that had long since closed its doors, but Alexander wasn't deterred. He insisted they pursue it, convinced that this was the trail that could finally connect him to the young man he was beginning to see as more than a stranger. As days passed, Alexander felt a sense of restlessness. Every minute spent waiting for the investigator's report felt like an eternity. He replayed his memories of his son over and over, trying to find details, clues, anything that might confirm his suspicions. The loss that had once been a cold, quiet ache was now a fire, consuming him with a desperate need to know the truth. Finally, after a long week, the investigator returned with more findings. They met in Alexander's office late in the evening, the city lights casting a dim glow over the polished wood and leather of the room. The investigator placed a thin stack of papers on the desk, his expression guarded. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his tone cautious. "I found a record. It's thin, not much to go on, but it's something." Alexander took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the papers. His eyes scanned the lines, the faint details of an adoption from the exact year his son would have been placed, the faint traces of an agency with a history of closed files, lost children. A single note at the bottom of the page caught his eye. The child had been moved between 3 different foster homes in his first 2 years, his records eventually lost in the system. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close enough to light a spark of hope. Alexander's mind was racing, every fiber of his being telling him that this wasn't just a coincidence. He needed to see Daniel, to tell him what he'd found, to bring him into the search so they could face the truth together. He drove to Daniel's restaurant, his heart pounding as he parked and made his way inside. The place was empty, the staff gone for the night, but he found Daniel cleaning up, stacking chairs and wiping down tables. Daniel looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted, a slight smile forming. "Didn't expect to see you here so late." Alexander took a steadying breath. "Daniel, I have news," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "There's a chance, a real chance, that we may be connected. I've found pieces of your past, things I believe lead back to my own family." Daniel's face paled, his eyes widening as he processed Alexander's words. What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying," Alexander continued, his voice shaking, "that you might be my son." They stood in stunned silence, both men caught between disbelief and a desperate yearning for the truth. Daniel's eyes flickered with shock, as if Alexander's words had struck him physically. He took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of a nearby chair to steady himself. For a moment, he looked lost, as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The quiet hum of the restaurant's air conditioning was the only sound, filling the empty space between them. What do you mean?" Daniel stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your son?" Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his confession settle between them. This wasn't how he had imagined telling Daniel, but there had been no time to prepare. The words had come out raw, born of desperation, leaving no room for finesse. "I know it sounds impossible," he said slowly, trying to choose his words carefully, "but I believe it's true. The pieces all line up. The birthmark, your background, even the timing. Everything points to it." Daniel stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "But I've spent my whole life not knowing. I mean, I was told my parents. I never thought." He stopped, pressing a hand to his forehead as though trying to absorb the enormity of it all. "How can you be sure? After all this time, how can you know that I'm really him?" Alexander felt his chest tighten. He understood Daniel's hesitation, his resistance to believing in something he'd buried long ago. But he was also acutely aware that he was looking at a young man who, like himself, had been wounded by the relentless ache of abandonment and loss. "I don't know for sure," Alexander admitted, his voice soft but steady. "But everything I've found, everything I've learned, it all points to the same answer." He hesitated, then added, "And even if it doesn't make sense right now, even if it feels unreal, I owe it to you, and to myself, to find out." Daniel looked down, his fingers tracing an invisible line on the edge of the chair. "All my life," he began, his voice shaking, "I wondered why I was alone. I made peace with it, you know? Told myself that some people are just meant to be alone, to build their lives from scratch." He looked up, meeting Alexander's gaze, his eyes raw with emotion. "And now you're here, telling me that maybe I wasn't alone. That somewhere someone cared." Alexander felt a pang of sorrow and regret, his heart heavy with the years they'd lost, the years he hadn't been there for the boy in front of him. "If you were my son," he said quietly, "then I failed you. I wasn't there when you needed me most. And for that, I can never make it right. But I am here now, and I want to try." Daniel's expression softened, the walls he'd built over the years beginning to crack. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "I don't know if I can handle finding out either way." A long silence fell between them, each man wrestling with his own fears. Finally, Daniel straightened, determination sparking in his eyes. "But I'll try," he said, his voice firmer. "I'll try to find out the truth. For both of us." Relief washed over Alexander, though he didn't show it. Instead, he nodded, feeling a cautious hope swell within him. "Thank you," he said simply. They spent the next few minutes in silence, each processing the enormity of the situation. Finally, Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a small slip of paper. There's a clinic in the city, he said. They can run a DNA test. Discreetly. It would give us the answers we need. Daniel looked at the paper in Alexander's hand, but didn't reach for it right away. He swallowed, his face a mixture of anxiety and resolve. All right, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Let's do it. The following morning, they arrived at the clinic together. An odd sight. Two men, generations apart, each carrying the same guarded expression. They spoke little during the car ride. The silence filled with the weight of anticipation. Daniel glanced out the window, his face tense, while Alexander stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The clinic was discreet, tucked away in a quiet part of town. Alexander had chosen it precisely for its privacy, knowing that he couldn't risk this becoming public. The receptionist greeted them with a warm smile, oblivious to the silent turmoil the two men carried as they checked in. The process was simple, a cheek swab, a few questions, and a wait. They were informed that the results would be available in 3 days. The timeline felt both excruciatingly long and terrifyingly short. As they left the clinic, Alexander glanced at Daniel, sensing the same tension in the young man's posture. Do you want to grab a coffee? Alexander offered, unsure of how else to fill the time. Daniel nodded, looking relieved for the distraction. They found a small cafe nearby, a cozy place with mismatched chairs and the aroma of fresh pastries. The warmth of the cafe was a stark contrast to the cold fear gnawing at Alexander's heart. They sat across from each other, both nursing cups of coffee in silence. Daniel finally broke it, his voice soft but laced with apprehension. What was he like? He asked, his eyes fixed on Alexander. Your son. I mean, if he was me. Alexander hesitated, his throat tightening. He hadn't allowed himself to remember in years. The memories were too painful, too precious to revisit. But he owed Daniel the truth, as much as he could give. He was bright, Alexander said finally, his voice distant, as if he were reaching across time. Curious, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. He had this smile, his voice caught, and he cleared his throat. He had this smile that could light up a room. And he had a kindness, even at that age, a way of seeing people's pain. I always thought he'd grow up to do something meaningful, something that would make a difference. Daniel listened quietly, absorbing each word as if it were a piece of himself he'd been searching for. He looked down, his fingers tightening around his cup. Maybe, he said softly, he did. They exchanged a brief, understanding glance, and for a moment, the tension between them softened. They spoke of small things after that, the restaurant, the challenges Daniel faced as a young business owner, Alexander's experiences in the corporate world. Each story was like a small bridge, spanning the years of distance, slowly easing the unfamiliar tension between them. But as they prepared to leave, the gravity of what lay ahead settled over them once more. In 3 days, they would know the truth, a truth that could either bring them together or shatter the fragile connection they had begun to build. I guess. I'll see you in 3 days then, Daniel said, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. Yes, Alexander replied, his gaze steady. 3 days. As they parted, Alexander watched Daniel walk away, a young man burdened by questions he had carried alone for far too long. Alexander knew that whatever the result, these 3 days would change everything. He only hoped that when the truth finally came, he would be ready to face it. The 3 days passed slowly, each hour stretching painfully as Alexander awaited the call from the clinic. He tried to throw himself into work, burying his thoughts in the usual meetings, deadlines, and negotiations, but his focus kept slipping. Every time his phone buzzed or his secretary entered his office, he felt his chest tighten, hoping that it was the call, the answer he had been waiting for. On the third morning, the phone rang just as he was pouring his first cup of coffee. He picked it up immediately, his hand trembling slightly. Mr. Hayes? This is Dr. Rayner from the clinic. The voice on the other end greeted him professionally. We have the results from the DNA test you requested. Alexander closed his eyes, taking a breath before responding. And there was a brief pause, the doctor's silence stretching unbearably. The tests show a definitive match, Dr. Rayner continued, his voice softening as he delivered the news. Daniel Scott is biologically related to you. He is your son." For a moment, Alexander couldn't speak, the reality sinking in with a weight he hadn't anticipated. All the years of emptiness, the heartache, and the quiet, unspoken hope he dared to nurture over the last few weeks, everything coalesced in this single, undeniable truth. His son was alive, and he was here, in this city, just a few miles away, carrying his father's face and living a life built entirely from scratch. "Thank you, doctor," he managed to say, his voice rough. He ended the call, his hand still holding the phone long after the line went silent. The knowledge settled over him slowly, each piece fitting into place as he sat at his desk, processing what this meant. After years of believing his son was lost forever, of accepting that painful void, he had found him again, by a twist of fate or perhaps a miracle. And now he would have to tell Daniel, to share the truth that would change everything for both of them. Later that afternoon, Alexander made his way to Daniel's restaurant, his heart pounding as he pulled up to the familiar building. The restaurant was just opening for the evening, the lights dimmed in preparation for the night ahead. He walked in, catching the scent of fresh herbs and spices, the warmth of the place filling him with an unexpected sense of home. This restaurant was the life his son had built, a testament to his resilience, and Alexander felt a surge of pride tempered with sorrow for all the moments he had missed. Daniel was in the kitchen, as usual, his sleeves rolled up and his focus unwavering as he prepared dishes. Alexander watched him through the glass door, his mind reeling at the thought that this young man, who had grown up with none of the guidance or love he should have received, had somehow found his way into Alexander's life once again. Finally, he knocked on the doorframe, and Daniel looked up, surprised to see him there. "Mr. Hayes," Daniel greeted, setting down a knife and wiping his hands on his apron. "You're here early. Everything all right?" Alexander nodded, though he could hardly find the words. He gestured for Daniel to join him, and they moved to a quiet corner table, away from the kitchen's bustling sounds. Daniel sensed the tension, his expression growing serious. "Did you get the results?" "Yes," Alexander replied, his voice soft. He looked directly into Daniel's eyes, the same eyes he had once seen in a smaller, younger face so many years ago. "You're my son, Daniel." Daniel froze, the impact of those words clear on his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, as if he were still trying to comprehend the reality of it. I can't believe it," he whispered, his hands clenching tightly as he looked down, grappling with a truth he had never expected to find. Alexander reached across the table, his hand hovering uncertainly before he let it rest on Daniel's. "I don't know why this happened the way it did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I am so sorry. I'm sorry for all the years you had to live without knowing, without any of the things you deserved." Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the window as he processed Alexander's words. "All those years," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet, restrained grief. "I told myself I was abandoned, that there was no one out there who cared enough to stay. I built my life on that understanding." He looked back at Alexander, his expression raw and uncertain. "And now you're here, and it's like the ground has been pulled out from under me." Alexander felt a deep ache in his chest, the realization of how much his son had suffered, of how his absence had shaped the man in front of him. He wished he could erase that pain, replace every moment of isolation with love and guidance, but he knew it was impossible to turn back the clock. "I understand," he said, his voice a whisper. "You have every right to feel that way, and I won't pretend that I can make up for what happened, for all the years you had to carry that alone." Daniel's hands shook slightly, and he pressed them against the table, taking a few deep breaths to steady himself. He was a man who had spent his life surviving, facing obstacles on his own, and now he was confronted with a truth that both liberated and destabilized him. He looked at Alexander, the hurt and disbelief mingling with something else, something fragile and uncertain. "I want to believe you," he said quietly, "but I don't know how. I don't know how to let this be real." Alexander nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions that Daniel must be feeling. He knew trust wouldn't come easily, and he was prepared to take whatever time was needed to earn it. Take your time, he said gently. You don't have to make sense of it all right now, but know that I am here.
I want to be here, and I'm not going anywhere.
For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past filling the empty space between them. Finally, Daniel looked up, his face softening, though his eyes remained guarded. Can you tell me about her? He asked hesitantly. My mother. I never even knew her name. Alexander felt a pang of sorrow at the mention of her. His late wife had been a kind, vibrant woman, someone who had loved their son with everything she had. The thought that Daniel had grown up without even a memory of her was heartbreaking. Her name was Emily, he said, his voice soft. She was everything. Strong, caring, the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking in. She loved you more than anything in this world. Daniel closed his eyes, a faint smile crossing his face, though it was tinged with sadness. I always wondered who she was.
If I looked like her or had any of her traits.
You do, Alexander replied. You have her kindness, her resilience.
You may not remember her, but I see her in you.
The corners of Daniel's mouth lifted slightly, and he looked down, trying to absorb the warmth of Alexander's words. They talked for a while, each question Daniel asked chipping away at the years of distance between them. Alexander shared stories, moments from his son's early childhood that had remained frozen in his memory, now reawakened by the boy who had grown into a stranger he somehow knew so well. By the time they parted that evening, something had shifted between them. Though the pain and confusion remained, there was a small bridge of understanding. They were two men bound by blood, yet divided by years of separation, each carrying scars that couldn't be erased overnight. But they had taken the first steps, tentative and uncertain, toward rebuilding something lost and fragile. As Alexander left the restaurant, he felt a glimmer of hope, the beginnings of a new bond that could grow stronger with time. And Daniel, watching him go, felt a quiet, reluctant belief in the possibility that he hadn't been alone after all. It would be a slow journey, and trust wouldn't come easily, but for the first time, he dared to imagine that perhaps he didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone anymore. In the days following their revelation, both Alexander and Daniel found themselves living in a strange, uneasy limbo. They had acknowledged the truth, but the gap created by years of separation loomed between them, vast and daunting. Alexander's initial joy at discovering his son had given way to an uncomfortable awareness of all that had been lost, and he struggled to find the right way to move forward. For Daniel, each interaction felt like navigating uncharted waters, a clash between the life he had built alone and the fragile hope of a connection he had never thought possible. One evening, Alexander called Daniel and invited him to his house, suggesting they spend time together in a more personal setting. To Alexander's surprise, Daniel agreed, though his voice held a note of caution. As he prepared for the evening, Alexander felt a flicker of anxiety he hadn't experienced in years. He was a man accustomed to control, but this situation was unlike any he had ever faced. This was his son, and there was no negotiation or strategy that could undo the past. Daniel arrived at the house around dusk, standing at the front steps of the grand estate with a look of uncertainty. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling the weight of the unfamiliar environment press down on him. The house was imposing, with high walls and vast windows, a physical manifestation of the wealth and power Alexander wielded. It was nothing like the small, cozy apartment Daniel had called home for years, a place where he had carefully curated every item to reflect his own hard-won independence. Alexander opened the door, his expression softened by an attempt at warmth. Daniel, he greeted, stepping aside to welcome him in. I'm glad you came. Daniel nodded, offering a small, hesitant smile as he stepped inside. His eyes wandered, taking in the luxurious interior. The polished marble floors, the tall, ornate columns, and the curated art that lined the walls. It felt like stepping into another world, one where he didn't quite belong. Despite his pride in the life he had created, he couldn't help but feel like an intruder. I know it's a lot, Alexander said, sensing Daniel's discomfort. I've been here a long time, but I still sometimes feel like a stranger in my own home. Daniel turned to look at him, surprised by the confession. It was the first time he had heard Alexander speak with vulnerability, and it made him feel a little more at ease. "It's impressive," he said, carefully choosing his words. "I've never seen anything like it." Alexander led him into a large, inviting room lined with shelves of books and filled with soft, comfortable furniture, a stark contrast to the rest of the imposing house. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow around the room, softening its edges. He gestured for Daniel to sit, then poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter on a side table. "To new beginnings," Alexander said, handing 1 glass to Daniel, who hesitated before accepting. "To new beginnings," Daniel echoed quietly, taking a sip. The whiskey was smooth, the warmth spreading through him, easing the tension in his shoulders. They sat in silence for a while, each man searching for the right words, the right place to start. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low but steady. "It's strange. I spent my whole life building walls, you know? Telling myself that I didn't need anyone, that I'd be fine on my own." He looked at Alexander, a hint of sadness in his gaze. "Now, all of that feels fragile, like it could just crumble." Alexander nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. "I can relate to that more than you'd think," he admitted. After I lost you, I threw myself into my work. I built my life around it. It was the only way I could keep going." He paused, his gaze distant as he remembered those early, bitter years. "But it left me alone. I convinced myself that I preferred it that way. But the truth is, I was afraid of losing again." Daniel took another sip, letting Alexander's words sink in. He hadn't expected his father, a man known for his power and ruthlessness, to reveal such vulnerability. It made him see Alexander in a different light, not as a stranger but as a man who had endured his own kind of suffering. "Why didn't you look for me?" Daniel asked softly, his voice carrying years of pent-up hurt. "After I was gone, why didn't you search harder?" Alexander's expression grew pained, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I did, Daniel," he said, his voice breaking. "I searched everywhere, hired investigators, went to the police, tried everything I could. But you disappeared without a trace. They told me that the chances of finding you were slim, and as time went on, everyone around me kept saying it was time to let go." He paused, struggling with the weight of the confession. "But I never really did. I just learned to live with the emptiness, to numb myself to it. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you went through because of it." Daniel looked down, his hands gripping his glass tightly. "I guess I always thought that if someone really cared, they'd find a way. But I know now it's not that simple." He took a shaky breath. "It was hard growing up with that feeling, the idea that no one was out there for me." A heavy silence settled between them, filled with unspoken pain. Alexander wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but he sensed that Daniel needed space, that he was still grappling with years of resentment and loneliness that couldn't be erased in a single night. After a while, Alexander asked, "Is there anything you want to know? Anything I can tell you about your life before?" Daniel looked at him, his expression guarded but curious. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I've always wondered what it would have been like to grow up in a family, to feel like I belonged somewhere." "You did belong," Alexander said softly, his voice filled with regret. "And if I could go back and change things, I would. I would give anything to have had you here with me, to watch you grow up." He swallowed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm here now, and I want to make things right however I can." Daniel's face softened, though he still looked unsure, as if he were afraid to let down his guard completely. "It's hard for me to trust this," he admitted. "I've lived my life depending on myself, on no one else. Letting you in, it's like giving up everything I've built." Alexander nodded, his heart aching at the walls Daniel had been forced to build. "I understand, and I don't expect you to accept this easily. But I'll be here, no matter how long it takes. I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence once more, the flickering fire casting shadows on their faces. For the first time, Daniel felt a faint sense of peace, as though the weight he had carried all his life had begun to lift. It wasn't gone. There was still too much hurt and mistrust to resolve, But in that quiet moment, he felt a glimmer of what it might be like to let someone in, to have family. After a while, Alexander stood and walked over to a small bookshelf, pulling down a dusty photo album he hadn't looked at in years. He handed it to Daniel, his hand lingering briefly on the cover. "I thought maybe you'd want to see this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's all I have of those years, but it's yours now if you want it." In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Daniel settled into an unspoken routine. Each Sunday afternoon, Daniel would come over to Alexander's house, and they would spend hours talking, sometimes about Daniel's restaurant, sometimes about the complexities of Alexander's business, and other times about fragments of the past they were slowly piecing together. There were still silences between them, moments when the weight of their history filled the room, but they were learning, cautiously and slowly, how to be around each other. One Sunday, as Daniel sat across from Alexander in the library, he glanced at the photo album on the coffee table between them. Since the night Alexander had given it to him, Daniel had often lingered over its pages. Each image seemed to unlock memories he couldn't quite reach, as if somewhere deep within him, a part of himself recognized those faces and places. "Do you remember that day?" Daniel asked, gesturing to a photo of himself as a toddler, wrapped in his mother's arms on a sunlit day, a park in the background. His mother's smile was radiant, her eyes filled with love as she looked down at her son. Alexander glanced at the photo, his face softening. "That was one of her favorite places," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "She loved that park. Every Sunday, we would go there and let you run around. She said you were the happiest when you were outdoors, free to explore." Daniel's face softened, imagining the life he'd had but had never truly known. "She looks happy," he murmured, tracing a finger over the image of his mother. "I always wondered if she'd been alive, if I would have." His voice trailed off, the unfinished thought hanging heavy between them. Alexander understood what he couldn't say. "She would have been there for you, every step of the way," he said firmly. "Your mother was fierce in her love. She wouldn't have let anything happen to you if she'd had any control over it. She would have been so proud of the man you are today." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Alexander, every visit from Daniel was like opening a wound that had scarred over long ago. Yet he welcomed it, believing that perhaps, in the end, healing could come. And for Daniel, each Sunday brought new revelations, filling in the empty spaces of his life with pieces of a family he'd never dared to imagine. On one particular Sunday, Alexander sensed that Daniel had something on his mind. His son's demeanor was different, an unusual restlessness about him. He'd been quieter than usual, his answers shorter, as if he were building up the courage to say something. "Is everything all right?" Alexander asked, setting down his coffee and leaning forward, concerned. Daniel hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. Alexander nodded, bracing himself. He had learned to expect that any question Daniel asked would likely be one he hadn't anticipated, something complex and raw. "Go on," he urged gently. Daniel looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "It's about my restaurant," he began, his voice tentative. "It's been doing well, better than I expected. But I'm getting to the point where I want to expand. Maybe open another location or start investing in new projects." Alexander's face softened, his pride for his son's ambition clear. "That's wonderful, Daniel. You've built something incredible on your own." Daniel gave a small, grateful smile, but his expression quickly turned serious again. "I guess I wanted to ask if maybe you'd want to be involved? I know it's not on the scale of what you're used to, but I thought maybe it could be something we do together. I mean, if you want." The proposal hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. It was an invitation for Alexander to be part of Daniel's life, not just as a father, but as a partner. Alexander felt a surge of emotions, gratitude, hope, and a flicker of pride so intense it caught him off guard. "Daniel," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored. I can't tell you what it means to me that you'd want me to be a part of this, and I'll help however I can. But I want you to know, this is your dream. You've built this with your own hands, your own vision. I'll support you, but you'll always be the one leading." Daniel nodded, visibly relieved, a small, genuine smile crossing his face. For him, this moment felt like a step he'd been both dreading and hoping for. Inviting Alexander into his business was his way of beginning to trust, of acknowledging that he didn't have to carry everything alone. And, perhaps, it was also his way of creating memories with his father, memories they had both missed out on. Over the next few months, they worked together on Daniel's expansion plans. Alexander used his connections and knowledge to secure resources, helping Daniel navigate the complexities of finance and logistics. They would spend hours going over plans, debating design ideas, and considering new concepts. There were moments of frustration, times when they clashed, each with his own distinct ideas, but through it all, there was a mutual respect, a growing bond that softened the rough edges of their past. One evening, after a particularly long day of planning, they found themselves sitting in the now-empty restaurant, sharing a late dinner that Daniel had prepared himself. The air was warm, the soft glow of the lights casting a sense of intimacy over the quiet space. As they ate, Alexander looked around, his gaze lingering on the walls decorated with photos of Daniel's journey, snapshots from his early days in small kitchens, moments captured with his team. The restaurant was an extension of Daniel's life, a testament to his resilience and vision. Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of pride, a deep admiration for the man his son had become despite everything he had endured. "This place," Alexander said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "It's a reflection of you, Daniel. Every corner, every detail. It shows who you are." Daniel looked down, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It means a lot that you think so," he replied. "This place saved me, in a way. It gave me a purpose when I felt like I had none. I guess it was a way for me to prove to myself that I could survive on my own." Alexander reached across the table, placing his hand over Daniel's. "And you did more than survive. You thrived," he said firmly. "And I am so proud of you. More than I can put into words." Daniel's face softened, his guarded expression melting away as he met his father's gaze. "You know," he said quietly, "for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere. And I don't think I could have gotten here without you." They sat in silence, the weight of Daniel's words settling between them, binding them closer together. In that moment, Alexander felt as if they had finally reached the other side of their journey, a place of understanding, of peace. They were still learning, still healing, but they had found something neither of them thought possible, a sense of family. As they finished their meal, Daniel looked at his father, a hesitant but hopeful glint in his eyes. "Maybe one day," he said slowly, "we could make this a tradition. Sunday dinners, just us. It doesn't have to be here, but somewhere. Somewhere we can just be ourselves." The first Sunday dinner at Alexander's home was simple yet filled with an unfamiliar sense of warmth. Alexander had prepared the meal himself, wanting to put in the effort and share something of himself with his son. He wasn't an exceptional cook, and he knew his attempt would pale in comparison to Daniel's culinary skill, but Daniel appreciated it all the same. There was a tenderness in the evening, a soft glow of understanding that wrapped around them as they shared a meal, building on a tradition that felt right, like a memory they had somehow always known. Each week, the dinners continued. Sometimes, they laughed over shared stories and small mishaps in Alexander's cooking. Other times, the conversations turned serious, delving into past hurts and long-buried questions. They learned how to give each other space, respecting each other's boundaries, while also finding ways to bridge the emotional distance that had once felt insurmountable. One Sunday evening, Alexander took a moment to reflect as he watched Daniel talk animatedly about a new recipe he was trying at the restaurant. It struck him how natural it felt, this routine they'd built. Here, across his own dining table, was his son. The boy he had thought lost forever, now a man with dreams and ambition, with scars and strength. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a deep sense of contentment, as though the ache that had lived within him for so long was finally beginning to fade. As dinner ended and they lingered over coffee, Daniel shifted in his seat, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know," Daniel began, his eyes focused on his coffee cup, I've been thinking a lot lately. About legacy, I guess. Alexander watched him, sensing that there was something significant coming. What do you mean? Daniel glanced up, his expression a mixture of hesitation and determination. I grew up without family, without roots, And all these years, I thought that I'd always be alone, that I'd be just a single branch out there on its own. He paused, collecting his thoughts. But now, with you here, it feels like maybe I do have a foundation. And I'd like to make something of it. Alexander felt his heart swell with a mixture of pride and emotion he couldn't quite express. You've already built something incredible, Daniel. Look at your restaurant, your life. It's a testament to everything you've overcome. Daniel smiled faintly, but his gaze was steady, resolute. That's true, but I want to build something more, something we both share. I've been working on plans to open another restaurant, maybe a few more in the coming years, but I want to do it with you.
Together.
The proposal took Alexander by surprise, though it filled him with a deep, unexpected joy. This wasn't just a business venture. It was Daniel's way of inviting him into a future, a vision they could build as father and son. Alexander's mind raced, thinking of the years he had poured into his own career, all the deals and boardrooms, the power and wealth he had accumulated. None of it had ever felt as significant as this moment, sitting across from his son, with a future they could share. Daniel, he began, his voice filled with emotion. I would be honored to do this with you, to be part of something that truly matters. There's nothing I'd want more. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that didn't need words, and Alexander felt the connection between them strengthen, becoming something unbreakable. In the months that followed, they poured themselves into the new project, working side by side, blending Daniel's creativity and culinary passion with Alexander's business acumen and experience. Their venture began to grow, slowly but surely, and each new success brought them closer together, binding them with a shared purpose. Through late nights of planning, site visits, and even some hands-on construction work, they discovered new sides of each other. Alexander learned that Daniel had a sharp, perceptive mind when it came to business decisions, an insight that often surprised him. And Daniel, in turn, saw a side of Alexander he'd never imagined. A man who, beneath the steely exterior, was generous, patient, and deeply invested in building something meaningful, something that transcended wealth and power. One evening, as they were going over blueprints in Alexander's office, Daniel paused, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He said, looking at his father, I think we make a pretty good team. Alexander chuckled, a warmth filling his chest. I think you're right. I never thought I'd have this chance. Daniel looked down, a hint of vulnerability crossing his face. Me neither, he murmured. But I'm glad we did. They worked in silence for a while, both savoring the quiet comfort they had come to find in each other's presence. In this office, amid the stacks of paper and plans for their new business, Alexander felt something he hadn't in years, a profound sense of belonging, of having a family. As their new venture flourished, so did their bond. Daniel often stayed over on Sundays, spending the evenings talking about their plans or simply sharing stories. The house, once cold and empty, began to feel alive again, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the warmth of shared meals. Then, one Sunday, Daniel arrived with a small gift, a framed photo of the two of them in front of their first restaurant. Alexander took it, surprised and touched, studying the image with a mixture of awe and gratitude. It's for your office, Daniel said, his voice soft, so you can remember that we did this
Together.
Alexander placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his gaze filled with pride. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This means more than you know. As the years passed, their restaurants became a success, each one a reflection of their shared vision. And through every challenge, every achievement, they stood side by side, a family bound not just by blood but by choice and resilience. Alexander's life, once defined by solitude, was now filled with purpose and connection. He had gained not only a son but a partner, a friend, and an anchor he had never realized he needed. And Daniel, who had once carried the weight of his past alone, now walked forward with the strength of his father by his side, knowing he was no longer an island. On a quiet evening years later, as they celebrated the opening of another restaurant, Alexander looked around at the gathering of friends, family, and colleagues, the laughter and warmth filling the room. He raised a glass to Daniel, his voice steady, his heart full. To family, he said, his gaze meeting Daniel's, who returned the smile with one of his own, a look of gratitude and love shining in his eyes. They clinked their glasses, a father and son, united at last. The years of pain and loss had shaped them, but they had forged something even stronger, something that would endure. A legacy built not on wealth or success, but on the power of forgiveness, resilience, and, above all, love.